Hello everyone, I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. We start tonight with breaking news right here in Washington. A federal judge has unsealed new evidence in former President Trump's 2020 election interference case. Tanya Chutkan, she's the federal judge, made public parts of the key filing from special counsel Jack Smith. He submitted this filing last week under seal. It has now been unsealed. As you might recall, Trump is facing 4 charges in this particular case, among them conspiracy to defraud the United States. The former president has pleaded not guilty. I want to bring in CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford to catch our audience up on this. Jan, this filing is a reflection of the special counsel's orientation in his case to the opinion rendered by the Supreme Court providing immunity for presidents in their official conduct. If you'd be so kind, pick it up from there.
You know, Major, people throw around words like unprecedented and extraordinary a lot, breaking news. This is all of those things. Right. It is a 165-page, let's be precise, filing dropped today that provides new factual details about President Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the January 6th election in 2020, complete with grand jury testimony that we've never seen before. And then it chronicles his arguments, Jack Smith's arguments, for why Trump is not immune from prosecution in the wake of that Supreme Court decision. So this, when you kind of step back and start analyzing all the things in this filing, it is extraordinary. It is unprecedented because on page after page, much of this we knew, and some of it from the House committee, but there is new information in here, including dramatic scenes where an aide bursts into the room where President Trump is sitting to tell him that they've taken Mike Pence to a secure location, and the president turns around, according to grand jury testimony, and says, "So what?" According to the filing. Dramatic stuff in there that people have not heard before. And then we have in this filing Jack Smith's arguments for why this prosecution should go forward, all 4 charges against the former president, despite that landmark ruling from back in July by the Supreme Court. And we talked about that at the time.
Absolutely.
There was a lot of overheated rhetoric around that, too. People saying that that the Supreme Court has shielded Trump from prosecution, that they had embraced Trump's claims that he had absolute immunity. And as you and I discussed at the time, that was not true. The court said that official acts could be immune, but presidents could be held liable or criminally prosecuted for their unofficial acts. And the court, in its opinion, referred to a case on the D.C. Circuit that kind of set out a roadmap for how Trump could be prosecuted. The actions of an office holder, or was he acting as an office seeker? And when you look through this filing that Jack Smith has dropped today, just over a month from the election, he tracks that reasoning in the Supreme Court's opinion, arguing that Donald Trump is acting as an office seeker, not as an office holder, and that therefore he is not immune from criminal prosecution for these, as Jack Smith says, unofficial acts.
That's a really important distinction, Jan. I'm glad you brought it up because as I read, and I've only had a few minutes, you've had a couple more minutes, but we're all still reading it as we go. What Jack Smith is saying is there is no role for a president in an election other than to preside over how the states handle it and then accept it. He was acting in a way that only a candidate, a self-interested candidate, would operate, not as the office holder of the presidency.
Right. He's an office seeker. And the vice president at times was also an office seeker, a running mate, or when he was...
And made different calculations and, importantly, different choices. And the vice president is present in this filing.
Absolutely, and that was a big question because the court did flag that the vice president and some of those communications, the Supreme Court did flag that some of those communications with the vice president may be considered official. But again, and Jack Smith did narrow some of that original indictment. But again, in these pieces of evidence that he puts forward to bolster these 4 charges against former President Trump, he is arguing that even Vice President Pence was acting either as a running mate, as a candidate, or as someone who is president of the Senate. And Trump had no role in that. So therefore, he argues, a lot of this evidence involving the former vice president should come in to bolster these 4 charges against President Trump. Now, what will happen now? Okay, we got an election just over a month away, right? And so now former President Trump is going to file his papers, which, of course, he's going to say, this is not true, or, you know, this is official, this is immunity, then all that paperwork, and then Smith can reply again, and then all that paperwork is due by the end of the month. October 29th, I think, is the deadline. And then Chutkan will sit down and make her decisions. So we're not going to have a decision for the election. It's going to take some time. If Trump wins, presumably this prosecution is over. If he loses, Chutkan will, go forward. Jack Smith will go forward. It will get appealed. I suspect that the D.C. Circuit is going to affirm Chutkan's decision, which I think will embrace this thinking. And then that's going to get right back up to the Supreme Court. And nothing would surprise me more than if the Supreme Court steps into this case. I think what Jack Smith has laid out here, the case against President Trump, his involvement with January 6th and his efforts alleged to overturn the 2020 election is a case that if he loses, will go forward, the D.C. Circuit will allow it, and the Supreme Court is not going to intervene.
You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Jan Crawford.
We'll see.
Thank you very much. I want to go down to Robert Costa and Nancy Cordes. Bob, you have done path-breaking reporting on parts of this story, all of them or most of them dealing with Vice President Pence. Your thoughts and reflections on what you have seen so far, and remind us of your reporting about what Vice President Pence did, knew, and suggested to President Trump in those fateful days.
Good to be with you, Major. Over the past 2 years, I've spoken with witnesses who are close to former President Donald Trump, the lawyers who were close to Trump in those final days of the Trump administration, and the Pence people, in particular, based on our reporting at CBS News, have become crucial witnesses for prosecution as they look to build this case for the Justice Department and Special Counsel Jack Smith. What they have found is what they believe to be an alleged criminal conspiracy to weaponize the vice president and the vice presidency against the United States to put forward fraudulent claims about the election and ultimately hold Trump in the White House. At first blush, it seems like a scheme that could never have happened in the United States. But Jack Smith is saying not only did it unfold in rapid force on January 6, 2021, but based on testimony and documents he's accrued throughout this investigation, he believes Trump was masterminding this conspiracy, what he calls crimes, to use Pence as a way to overturn the election by walking away from the electorate and calling for alternate electors to come forward in the states. And what Jack Smith does is he builds upon what the January 6th committee does. Previous reporting has revealed that so many lawyers around Trump were telling him, you can do this, but others were saying you can't. And that statement of lawyers saying you can't do this is very important as Jack Smith moves ahead, because it's not just like Trump was listening to legal counsel. What we have found is that Trump seized on this idea that he could stay in power by using Pence. John Eastman, the conservative lawyer, wrote a memo that Bob Woodward and I uncovered that detailed how Trump could do this in Eastman's view. Pence's lawyer said this is not legal. Pence said, I can't do it, it's unconstitutional. Trump was not persuaded. He went forward with his relentless effort to stay in power.
Nancy, I want to bring you into this conversation because, as we all remember, as the vice presidential debate reached its conclusion last night, there was a sizable moment of political drama. Governor Tim Walz asked J.D. Vance, who won the 2020 election? Did Trump lose? J.D. Vance said, I'm only focused on the future. Governor Walz said, that's a damning non-answer. This all is part of this larger national conversation, made more vivid in part by the new revelations in Jack Smith's filing unsealed today.
Right. And that moment from the debate last night is already appearing in Harris ads across the country today, Major. And it feeds into a larger argument that the Harris campaign has been making, which is that because of this immunity ruling, if Trump were to return to the Oval Office, he would be emboldened. He would be unfettered because he would be less concerned about criminal prosecution. And then taking it a step further, based on what you heard from J.D. Vance last night, still unwilling to concede that Trump lost the election 4 years later, they make the case that this time around, Trump wouldn't have a Mike Pence who was willing to step up and do the right thing in that fateful hour as he did. They argue that J.D. Vance is clearly still willing to perpetuate this lie, unwilling to go against Trump even when he knows that Trump is in the wrong. And so what we saw last night in the final moments of the debate, what we're seeing in this filing today is something that the Harris campaign is going to be returning to again and again over the next 35 days as they make the case that Donald Trump is not fit to return to the Oval Office for another 4 years.
And Nancy, let me stick with you for just one more question. In the aftermath of the debate, and you brought up some of this last night in our special coverage, what's been the assessment of those closest to the Harris-Walz campaign and Democrats outside of that inner circle about how things went for Governor Walz?
Well, there's definitely a sense that there were opportunities that Walz could have seized on that he missed last night, whether because he was nervous or unpracticed or simply wanted to, resist the temptation to go negative. They feel that he left some opportunities on the table. On the other hand, they woke up this morning, Major, and they were pleasantly surprised to learn that in many polls, Walz actually appeared to do pretty well. When you ask voters what they think, it either came out as a draw or in some polls he actually was deemed the victor. And so that was encouraging to them. They've been arguing that yes, J.D. Vance may be a smoother debater, but they think that Walz told the truth and that at the end of the day, what voters are going to remember from this debate is this exchange at the end about January 6th, something very easy for Americans to understand and hold on to, who won the election 4 years ago.
Our thanks to Nancy Cordes at the White House, Robert Costa on the road on the campaign trail. Thank you very much.